Lecture 7, Vehicles to Nirvana, the Schools of Buddhism.
Buddhism began with one man teaching the path to awakening. And today, it's a religion of hundreds of millions of people who live in virtually every region of the world. The path to Buddhism's becoming a world religion began when a group of disciples who followed the Buddha developed into a community of monks known as the Sangha, which continued to grow after the Buddha's death. In the tradition of Indian renouncers, they wandered from place to place, practicing, teaching, and begging. But once a year during the monsoon season, travel becomes so difficult that wanderers tend to settle in one place. I'd read about Indian monsoons, but it wasn't until I experienced them that I realized how torrential the rain is and how difficult they make moving around. I mean, what was a road can quickly become a river. For the 3-month rainy season, the monks settled down, creating the early monastic community. But as with all religious traditions, after communities form, disputes break out, and these communities split and then split again. Over time, different schools, sects, or denominations form. So what are the major divisions within Buddhism? The Buddhist world is divided into 3 major schools known as vehicles, as they carry their practitioners to liberation. There's Theravada Buddhism in South and Southeast Asia, that's Sri Lanka, Thailand, Myanmar or Burma, Cambodia, and Laos. Mahayana in East Asia, China, Korea, and Japan, and also Vietnam. And Vajrayana in Tibet, Bhutan, and other parts of South and Central Asia. Theravada Buddhism sees itself as the most authentic preserver of the original teachings of the historical Buddha. The name Theravada itself means the doctrine of the elders. The other forms of Buddhism, generally speaking, don't reject the teachings of Theravada Buddhism, but rather build upon them and expand them. Theravada rules and codes and teachings and practices can be found in the other vehicles as well. We'll begin with the most important Buddhist rules, the precepts. All committed Buddhists, monks and lay people, commit to the 5 precepts. And these are as follows. Non-harming, to abstain from killing and harming others. Non-stealing, to abstain from taking what is not yours. Non-lying, to abstain from false speech or speech that slanders or harms. No sexual impropriety. For monks, this requires celibacy. For lay people, this means sex only within marriage. And no intoxicants that cause heedlessness. When a novice is initiated into the order and receives his robe and his bowl, he receives 5 additional precepts, which move beyond the more universally applicable ethics of the first 5 precepts to particular practices that sustain the monastic community and prevent the development of vices that hinder the monk's development. No eating after noon, so only 1 meal per day, ideally. No sleeping on elevated platforms. No adorning oneself, so no jewelry or perfume. And no attending entertainment, that's theater and concerts and movies and the like. And no handling of money. When a man decides to go to full ordination as a monk, he goes beyond these 10 precepts, far beyond, and adheres to 227 rules, which make up the monastic code. For a nun, that number is even higher, 311. These codes contain required and forbidden acts along with the punishment for violation. In Theravada countries, children can take lower ordination as a novice at a young age, in some cases 7 or 8, though more often near 13. Higher ordination normally occurs around the age of 20. If you go to Southeast Asian countries, you'll likely see many young boys walking around with robes and shaved heads. Most Thai and Burmese men, for instance, have some monastic experience. But only some of them remain monks throughout their lives. Many boys spend a short time in a monastery, perhaps a single rainy season or a few years, where they learn the teachings and practices of Buddhism and gain discipline and character. When a boy joins the order, there's a ritual in which his head is shaved, and he recites the refuge formula, taking refuge in the three treasures, the Buddha, his teaching, the Dharma, and the monastic community, the Sangha. He receives his robe and a bowl, and he receives a Buddhist name. Some monasteries are built in forests, which allows the monks to focus on meditation away from society. There are also urban monasteries in which the monks frequently interact with lay people, and they'll perform a range of functions, including teaching, healing, performing rituals, and providing guidance. Around half the primary schools in Thailand are in monasteries. The monks engage in a range of activities as part of their practice, including meditation, chanting, and textual study. Theravada monks receive their food from begging, whereas many East Asian monks grow their own food. Every morning they make their begging rounds. They walk around with their bowls and receive offerings from lay people who gain positive karma or merit by donating food to the monks. You might think that all Buddhists meditate, but in Asian countries, there's a class of monks devoted to meditation, but most lay people don't meditate regularly. They might sit meditation during special rituals or on holidays, but for the most part, their focus is on supporting the monastic community through donations, which allows them to gain merit. In recent years, though, more lay people have become interested in meditating, and there are teachers of Vipassana meditation who've opened centers that draw lay people. A major annual holiday in Buddhist countries is called Vesak, which celebrates the birth, enlightenment, and death of the Buddha. During Vesak, which falls in May or June in Southeast Asian countries, Buddhist lay people will affirm their adherence to the precepts. They'll often take on additional precepts for the period of the holiday. They'll often eat only vegetarian food. In Sri Lanka, liquor stores and slaughterhouses are closed during Vesak. People gather in temples for chanting and rituals, including a ritual of pouring water over a statue of the Buddha, which reenacts the bathing of the baby Siddhartha after his birth and represents the washing away of bad karma. Monks give sermons to lay people, many of which draw on stories of the Buddha's many lives. The term Mahayana, which means great vehicle, is first used around the 1st century BCE. Mahayana Buddhists labeled the other schools Hinayana, which means small vehicle, a term that can seem somewhat pejorative. Some scholars believe that the main early use of the word Mahayana is to refer to the path of a figure that would become associated with Mahayana Buddhism, the Bodhisattva. In its most basic meaning, a Bodhisattva is a being who's on the path to Buddhahood, one who's formed the intent to reach enlightenment. But in the Mahayana tradition, the Bodhisattva takes on greater meaning and plays a more significant role. In some Mahayana texts, there was criticism of the earlier schools because the pursuit of nirvana was undertaken primarily for the benefit of the practitioner. So, if you followed the Eightfold Path diligently, you could become a liberated being, known as an arhat, which would end your suffering and free you from the cycle of samsara. But what about the rest of us? Well, you're liberated, the rest of us are suffering. The approach in Mahayana is that the Bodhisattva aims to liberate all sentient beings from suffering. So as the Bodhisattva advances along the path to awakening and is poised to achieve full Buddhahood and escape the cycle, he or she chooses to stay in the cycle of samsara in order to liberate all other beings from suffering. Bodhisattvas delay enlightenment till everyone else can come with them. And this is why the earlier schools, such as Theravada, were labeled the small vehicle, because only one being at a time achieved liberation. Mahayana called itself the big vehicle because its spiritual figures aimed to bring everyone over on the vehicle to liberation. The Bodhisattva, then, is characterized by compassion over everything else. This teaching led to the development of many important Bodhisattva figures in Buddhism. I don't want to overemphasize this analogy, but in some ways they're a bit like saints, in that they're associated with particular specialties and they're very accessible to people. While fully enlightened Buddhas can seem transcendent and distant, helpful bodhisattvas can seem closer to us. One of the most popular bodhisattvas is the Bodhisattva of compassion, whose name in Sanskrit is Avalokiteshvara. In Tibet, he's known as Chenrezig, and is a special protector bodhisattva for the Tibetan people. And in East Asia, this male bodhisattva becomes female and is known as Guanyin in China and Kannon in Japan. This is the being who hears the cries of the world, whose multi-armed, multi-headed forms can respond to our needs and reach out to help us. Other bodhisattvas include Manjushri, the bodhisattva of wisdom, often portrayed with a sword that cuts through ignorance, and Maitreya, who will eventually become the Buddha for the next historical cycle. An important difference between Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism involves the texts that they accept as authoritative. In Mahayana, many new sutras, beyond those accepted by Theravada, were accepted as authoritative and became very important well after the Buddha's death. These include two sutras that we'll look at in this lecture, the Lotus Sutra and the Heart Sutra. The Lotus Sutra is one of the most important sutras in all of Mahayana Buddhism. It's had an especially profound impact on China and Japan. There are stories of devout Buddhists who recite the text daily for decades, and many believe that the sutra, and in some cases not only its content but also the physical book, or even just the title itself, possesses magical powers. One of the features that you'll discover upon opening the text is that unlike the early sutras that were directed at monks and featured analyses of the mind or instructions for meditation, this text contains many parables. These are narratives with lessons about Buddhism that are often then explained in the text, and we can see that these texts could be easily appreciated by lay people. It's one of the characteristics of Mahayana Buddhism that lay people can advance to the highest levels on the path to enlightenment. One important parable tells of a doctor and his sons. The sons accidentally consume poison that affects their minds, and as a result, they become so confused that they'll not take the antidote offered by their father. In order to shock them into the realization that they must take this medicine and take responsibility for their own healing rather than rely on their father to save them, he leaves home and then sends back word that he's dead. The ploy works, and the stunned sons take the medicine and are cured. And the father returns home and reveals that he's alive. Let's break the story down. In this and other Lotus Sutra parables, we see something we didn't see in Theravada Buddhism. Representing the Buddha as a father figure and his followers as children. Through the story, we discover the remarkable Mahayana transformation of the conception of the Buddha. The reader learns that the historical Siddhartha Gautama is only a partial truth. Like the father of the story, the Buddha had to lead us to believe something that wasn't really true for our own good, that he was an ordinary person who died. But the fuller truth is that the human life of Siddhartha Gautama was a manifestation of a more transcendent Buddha, a being that attained enlightenment eons ago and takes human form for the sake of leading human beings on the path to liberation. We can see that this way of looking at the Buddha is a significant transformation from the more human way that Theravada Buddhists see him. The other important Mahayana sutra we'll examine is the Heart Sutra. This is the shortest of what are called perfection of wisdom sutras. It gives the heart of the teaching in a very concise form. These sutras teach one of the most important and most misunderstood concepts in Mahayana Buddhism: emptiness, or shunyata. This is a term that you'll hear frequently in Mahayana Buddhism. They'll say, all things are empty. This has been misinterpreted to mean some kind of nihilistic doctrine, something like nothing exists or nothing matters. Buddhists don't believe either of these things. When they say things are empty, they mean empty of inherent existence or empty of a separately existing essence. This is closely related to the no-self doctrine we examined earlier. Everything is what it is only because it's composed of other things. It's caused and conditioned by other beings, so nothing exists on its own. So the flip side of emptiness is another very important Mahayana concept: interdependence. Vietnamese Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh writes, "To be is to interbe." We cannot just be by ourselves. We have to interbe with every other thing. And he illustrates this by asking us to contemplate a piece of paper. He said that if we look carefully, we can see a cloud in a piece of paper. Without a cloud, he writes, there will be no rain. Without rain, the trees cannot grow, and without trees, we cannot make paper. The cloud is essential for the paper to exist. And he then goes on to discuss all the other things necessary for the paper to be. The sun, the logger who cut down the tree, the wheat that makes the logger's food, and so on and so on. It may seem quite dramatic, but this is the essence of the teaching. If you start with any one object in the world and think about the things without which it would not be, and then branch off from those things and so on, you'll ultimately get to everything else that exists. In other words, every object is linked with every other object in the universe. It all interexists. There's a form of Mahayana Buddhism called Huayan that emphasizes this interdependence. And a famous Huayan text illustrates the teaching with a metaphor of Indra's net, a vast net of interconnected, multifaceted jewels, where each facet of each jewel reflects all the other jewels in it. This is why Thich Nhat Hanh concludes his poetic discussion of the piece of paper with the following observation. As thin as this sheet of paper is, it contains everything in the universe in it. So emptiness doesn't mean nothing exists, but rather it tells us how things exist. They exist emptily. Here's where it gets really radical. The Heart Sutra states there are no sufferings, no origins, no cessations, no path. That list probably looks familiar to you. Suffering, origin, cessation, path. It's the Four Noble Truths. The text is saying that even these must be seen as empty. If everything's empty, Buddhism itself is empty. What's the purpose of telling this to Buddhists? Well, remember, a central focus of Buddhism is getting rid of craving and grasping. The teachings of Buddhism that we looked at in the last lecture can help people get rid of their clinging to things. But what if this is replaced by attachment to Buddhism? Emptiness acts as a deconstructing idea that helps to prevent grasping at anything, including Buddhism itself. The final vehicle that we'll look at is Vajrayana, which is known as the diamond or thunderbolt vehicle. The most well-known version of this is Tibetan Buddhism, which developed around the 6th, 7th centuries CE in India, and has its origins in texts called Tantras. Tantric texts arose in both the Hindu and Buddhist traditions, and they contain esoteric teachings that often require initiation in order to be understood. One form of Tantra, the left-handed path, teaches that one can engage in traditionally forbidden practices on the path to liberation. You might have heard of tantric sex, for example. But it's important to keep in mind that these practices are not for the sake of pleasure, but rather, when carried out in the right spiritual context, can lead one through desire to the other side, liberation. One uses desire to become free from desire. A tantric text states, water in the ear can be washed out by water, and a thorn removed by a thorn. In this way, the wise can get rid of passions by means of passion itself. Because of the risks inherent in such an approach, one needs the guidance of a teacher, a guru, so one would not be led astray. The importance of the guru in esoteric forms of Buddhism is a central theme. Meditative practice in this form of Buddhism can involve visualizing an image of the guru, or of Buddhas or bodhisattvas, and identifying oneself with him. Many practitioners keep images of their gurus on their altars, and devotion to one's guru is a vital part of this practice. While some forms of Buddhism have a more unadorned aesthetic and emphasize simplicity, such as Zen, which we'll encounter later, Tibetan Buddhism features rich artistic representations. As anyone who's seen the magnificent multicolored portrayals of Buddhas and bodhisattvas, or the abstract geometric patterns of circles and squares called mandalas, will know. One of the major themes of Tibetan Buddhism is transmutation. Through the practices of the tradition, one transforms oneself into a Buddha. More specifically, one transforms one's body, speech, and mind into the body, speech, and mind of a Buddha. In order to do this, a wide range of practices are drawn upon. Some of the most prominent are the so-called 3 M's. First is mudras, which correspond to the body. These are gestures or positions that are most often made by the hands and the fingers. Second, mantras, which correspond to speech. And these are verbal formulas, sacred utterances that are repeated by the practitioner. The most important mantra in Tibetan Buddhism is Om Mani Padme Hum, which means Om, the jewel is in the lotus. This has been interpreted in many ways, including the joining of wisdom and compassion and the bringing together of male and female energies. In Tibetan Buddhism, not only are mantras recited, but they're often written on prayer flags, so that each time the wind blows, the mantra is spread. Or they're put on prayer wheels, so each spin is like a recitation. The third M refers to mandalas, which are sacred geometric diagrams. These correspond to mind. Mandalas are diagrams that contain concentric sets of circles and squares. They're usually very colorful. They can be filled with images of deities and Sanskrit syllables or various symbolic shapes. The mandala can be seen as the representation of the cosmos or a celestial realm of Buddhas, and can also represent the mind of the practitioner. Meditating on a mandala is a way to bring about wisdom and awakening in the mind, and the creation of mandalas out of a variety of materials is itself a transformative meditative practice. One of the most well-known forms of this is the creation of the Kala Chakra sand mandala, in which a detailed mandala is created by monks using colored grains of sand. It takes many days and requires astonishing patience, concentration, and memory. When the mandala is finished and the appropriate rituals are done, it's eventually swept into a container, reminding us that everything's impermanent, and it's poured as an offering into a river. Because of the esoteric nature of this form of Buddhism, people must be initiated into the practices. And there are many preliminary practices that cultivate and express the profound commitment and devotion necessary to advance along the path. These can include 100,000 prostrations or 100,000 recitations of a mantra. Through the initiation, the practitioner becomes connected with the guru, who will be their spiritual guide throughout their lives. Buddhism first came to Tibet in a significant way in the 7th century CE. At the time of Buddhism's arrival in Tibet, Theravada, Mahayana, and Tantric Buddhism all existed. So all forms ultimately came to Tibet. To a large extent, the Tibetan approach has been to synthesize all these forms together. So whereas Theravada Buddhism can be seen as original or authentic early Buddhism, Tibetan Vajrayana can be seen as comprehensive Buddhism. We've discussed how spiritually evolved beings can choose to return to the cycle of samsara to help others, bodhisattvas. In Tibet, this system is more structured than in most Buddhist societies. When a high-ranking lama dies, a religious leader, a group of other high-ranking lamas, after time passes, commence the search for the new rebirth of that lama. When ordinary people die, their future rebirths are determined by their karma. We don't have a choice in the process. We're propelled through the cycle by the force of our karma. But highly advanced people who choose to come back to help others decide on their rebirths. The most famous example in Tibet is the Dalai Lama. The current Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, is the 14th Dalai Lama, which means that he's the 14th rebirth in this line. Dalai Lamas are considered to be manifestations of the Bodhisattva of compassion. It's Chenrezig in Tibetan. So the Dalai Lama is seen as a living manifestation of compassion. So how are Dalai Lamas, or known as tulkus, discovered? Clues as to the identity of the new rebirth are received in many ways. First, the previous Dalai Lama might leave a clue as to where he intends to be reborn. This could occur while he's alive or even after his death. For example, it's said that the body of the deceased 13th Dalai Lama while lying in state, turn toward the northeast, indicating the direction that the rebirth could be found. Then, high-ranking lamas will visit a sacred lake and wait for visions there. In this case, they saw the visions of a particular house. When the candidates are found, they're tested. Items that belong to the previous Dalai Lama are placed alongside very similar items. And if the child being tested chooses only the items that belong to him, that's also a sign. It's said that the young Tenzin Gyatso recognized the lamas that came to the door of the house. He reached for the beads that one of them wore and said, "These are mine. Why do you have them?" Those beads had belonged to the 13th Dalai Lama. He then correctly chose all the items that had belonged to the previous Dalai Lama, even though shinier, more appealing objects lay nearby. The child is also confirmed by an oracle, after which he's educated and trained in a wide range of areas, including philosophy, traditional medicine, ritual, and the arts. The rest of the 14th Dalai Lama's story is remarkable, and I can only mention a few highlights here. You can read his autobiography. He was enthroned at the age of 15, at a time when the newly created Communist People's Republic of China was asserting sovereignty over Tibet. The young Dalai Lama tried to navigate the complicated relationships between Tibet and China, but in 1959, following an uprising in Tibet against China, the Dalai Lama and other Tibetans went into exile, eventually setting up a government in exile in Dharamsala, India, where they remain to this day. Until 2011, the Dalai Lama was both the spiritual and the temporal leader of the Tibetan people, although those who remain in Tibet are not allowed to openly show devotion to him or even have his picture, as the Chinese government forbids this. In 2011, the Dalai Lama gave up his temporal authority so that the Tibetan government in exile would have a democratically elected prime minister, although the Dalai Lama retains his position as spiritual leader. For most Tibetans, he continues to serve as the symbol of the Tibetan people and is worshipped as a living bodhisattva. On the first day of the Tibetan New Year celebration, called Losar, the Dalai Lama receives offerings and wishes are made for his long life so that he can continue to serve his people. Losar features many other activities, including the preparation of special foods, such as noodles and dough balls, public debates and teachings about Buddhism, and dances. The last topic we'll explore in this lecture is one of Tibetan Buddhism's most fascinating and powerful texts and its uses, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. In Tibetan Buddhist thought, all of life can be seen as a series of in-betweens. We're always in motion, moving from one state to another. But there are certain intersections between states that are particularly potent. For example, the line between wakefulness and sleep, between ordinary consciousness and meditative states, and especially between life and death. These in-between states are called bardos. Tibetans focus a number of practices on navigating these powerful in-betweens, as they offer opportunities for seeing into the true nature of reality and attaining wisdom. For example, there's a form of Tibetan dream yoga where one learns to remain conscious and aware while in a dream state. This is also called lucid dreaming. If one learns to retain awareness while crossing the wake-dream border, this may help at the point of death, when another border must be crossed. Tibetans believe that after death, one enters into the post-death bardo states, where one exists in a form known as a bardowa, usually for 49 days. This is 7 rounds of 7-day existences. Some people have trouble coming to terms with their deaths, and they may cling to this life, lingering around the people and places to which they're attached. The bardowa might experience helpful figures guiding them through the process. They may also encounter frightening figures. The Tibetan Book of the Dead is essentially a travel guide for the recently deceased. Its actual name is the Bardo Total, which indicates that it's a guide to liberation in the bardo states. The book is read by a lama or other religious authority at the bedside of a dying or recently deceased person. The book often uses exclamations to get the person's attention and aims to get the person to accept death, to let go of attachments to this world, and ultimately to recognize their true nature as pure awareness, seen as light. The text reads, "Hey, noble one, now you have arrived at what is called death. You are not alone. It happens to everyone. You must not indulge in attachment and insistence on this life. Do not cling. If one recognizes one's pure inner Buddha awareness, one can be liberated from the cycle of rebirth." Buddhism underwent major transformations in East Asia, where many new forms, such as Zen, arose. In our next lecture, we'll explore the indigenous religious traditions of one of the other great ancient world civilizations, China, which featured a worldview that differed in some profound ways from what we've seen in India.